Hello and welcome to this Project A GCSE ready work. These little projects are going to introduce you to some of the key areas of the different modules in your GCSE, and also some of the different skills that you will need to develop in order to be successful during your GCSE. You will need, to help you do this when you're watching this video, this work booklet. You'll find it on class charts or pod, and it's also in the description. There's a link to it as a Google document at the bottom of this video. The main purpose of this is to give you some space to write down the tasks, write down your answers. You can either print this off and do it as you go along, or you could type in it and print it out at a later date. It's entirely up to you. You could even just watch this, have that open, and just write your answers down on a piece of paper. This particular project is going to focus on women from 1918 to 39 in Germany, during the Weimar Republic and during Nazi Germany. The Weimar Republic is just how we refer to Germany between the years 1919 and 1933, when Germany was a republic, having got rid of the Kaiser after the First World War. And then Nazi Germany obviously refers to the period from 1933 onwards, when Hitler was in power. And we're going to have a look and see precisely how the role of women changed or stayed the same during the Weimar period and the Nazi period. Okay, first thing you're going to do, and you'll be able to see this in your work pack, is you're going to have a look at a little video clip which is going to come along in a moment. What you're looking for is how Matt Fry, who is the BBC journalist who is narrating this clip, how he talks about a cultural clash in Berlin in the 1920s. Think about what was happening in Berlin in the 1920s, and think about how this might have had an impact on women and their role in German society. So consider what he's saying about the way in which there were contested ideas about the way society should develop. He talks about Joseph Goebbels, who was the Nazi propaganda minister, his ideas about what Germany should be like. Compare that with the freedoms and the cultural expression that was happening in Berlin in the 1920s, and also consider how, therefore, this conflict over ideas might have had an influence on the role of women. So here we go. Watch the clip and then try and think about how you're going to answer the two questions connected to the clip.
It was 1919. Germany had been defeated in the Great War. The Kaiser had been forced to abdicate, and after a bloody battle for Berlin with the communists, a fragile republic was declared. The liberalism of the new so-called Weimar Republic would encourage a host of new creative ideas in Berlin, but also dangerously destructive ones. It was an era that was best depicted by the painter George Gross. In the toads of possession, rich Berlin industrialists count their money while looking down on the city's downtrodden workers and wounded soldiers. Gross wrote in a letter that this image was to Berlin what Hogarth's Gin Lane was to London.
It is a large picture of hell, of grotesque corpses and lunatics. On the right, a young man is throwing up on the canvas all the illusions of youth. I'm totally convinced that this epoch is sailing down to its own destruction.
One day, George Gross made his way, as usual, to the local cigar shop. It was just another normal Berlin day in the 1920s. The cigar man smiled and handed over Gross's regular order. Gross smiled back, and then he noticed something different. Instead of the usual hammer and sickle lapel badge that the cigar man used to wear, there was now a different symbol. It was strange, it was exotic, and a few years later, it was to define a whole nation. In 1926, the new Nazi Party organizer for Berlin arrived in the city. He was a fresh-faced young man named Joseph Goebbels. And the story of his ideological assault on the city is one of the great, grim turning points in Berlin history. Goebbels had grown up a poor child with a club foot. He yearned for some kind of national rebirth, and he found hope in Hitler's National Socialists. The Nazi Party promised a return to a strong, militarized, racially pure Germany. He took over a grubby party office in a city where the Nazis were virtually unheard of. Goebbels feared the power of the left-leaning social satire of George Gross and other radical artists of Berlin. He set about turning the city towards National Socialism. Goebbels would make it his job to turn Red Berlin into Nazi Berlin. The absence of imperial rule made the city a dangerous place, but it also transformed the social and cultural life of Berlin. Heavy censorship had been lifted, and as people fought on the streets, Berlin danced to the international craze of jazz and cabaret in a way that no other city on the planet did.
Okay, now it's time to pause and have a go at the task. So the main thing you should have got in answer to the question is that what we see about in Berlin in the 1920s is a clash of cultures. So we see on the one hand a more liberal idea, we see lots of experimentation, we see lots of different political ideas. On the other hand, we see the Nazis wanting to stop that and wanting to impose Nazism, and we saw a brief glimpse there of how there was a great opportunity for expression for women. We saw the mention of jazz music, and we saw flappers and dancers, and we saw an expression of femininity and sexuality in a way that hadn't been seen before. And so the 1920s was a time of opportunity for women at the same time as people disapproved of the changing position of women in society. Okay, now it's time to move on to task 2. What can we infer about women in the Weimar Republic from this painting? Remember, when you are making an inference, that you are picking something in the source, you are saying what you can infer from that, what does that suggest about women, and then you are supporting that suggestion, what you can see in the painting. So have a go at trying to infer two things. So we can infer this because the painting shows us this. We can infer this because the painting shows us this. So pause this, have a go at making those inferences as part of task 2. So I would say there are several things that we can infer here. It tells us quite a lot about how the artist is depicting women, but so it's their impression of how women are in the Weimar Republic. But we can infer about women in the Weimar Republic several things from this painting. First thing we could infer is that women were more liberated in their social practices. So here we have a woman in the picture who is smoking and drinking. So women are more liberated to go out into different social spaces. The other thing we could infer is that women were seen by some people as being in spaces that men had traditionally inhabited. So she has been painted in quite a masculine way. Look at her hands. Look at her haircut and her face. You could argue that she's been painted in quite a masculine way. Furthermore, we could infer that women were more able to express themselves in the Weimar Republic, more able to wear makeup, more able to change their appearance in public, and we can see that from the lipstick that she's wearing. We could infer that she is not necessarily dressed in a traditional way. You know, she has a relatively short skirt on, and again, this means that she's expressing her femininity, but at the same time as that, she's been painted in a way which can make her look quite masculine. So we could infer that the painter, in this case the painter is Otto Dix, that he is a little bit disapproving of the way women's role in the Weimar Republic has changed. But certainly this image of a woman smoking and drinking and being out in a social space, in a club or a pub, that is suggestive of something of a change in the role of women that has taken place after the First World War in the 1920s during the period of the Weimar Republic. Okay, for the second part of task 2, you're going to need to read this information here that you have in your work booklet, and you need to look for the changes in women's lives that took place in the Weimar Republic in the post-First World War period. You need to list those changes, and you also then need to make a comment on how much change you think there was overall in general, and think about the extent to which there was change for all women in society and how much change there actually was in different areas like politics, work and leisure. So pause this now, read that information, complete task 2, and we'll come back and see what you came up with. So, what you should have written down, certainly in the political sphere, there was quite a large change. Women got the vote in 1918. This was important, which meant that women had political equality with men. Women served in the Reichstag, the German parliament. Women were seen to have and did have equal rights with men under the new Weimar Constitution. At work, more women went out to work. Just as happened in Britain, the labour shortage during the war, with men off fighting in the war, meant they needed more women to work, so therefore women went out to work, and also women did jobs that women previously hadn't done. Women in leisure, we see information about a new woman and about women getting involved more in leisure pursuits, in going out more, in experiencing different nightlife and expressing their femininity more. However, it is fair to say that this was mainly unmarried and young women, and mainly middle-class women, and this wasn't the case for everybody. But in German society, the birth rate was falling, divorce was rising, women were seen as having a greater empowerment, were seen as being more equal to men, and were asserting themselves in a way that hadn't been seen before. Now, the question of how much change there was is an interesting question. Here we have some images of stereotypical flappers, dancing girls, the new woman exploring social spaces that women hadn't previously explored, involved in nightlife and cabaret culture. But as is outlined in your reading, not all women were able to embrace this lifestyle. In fact, many women did not, and in fact many women and men disapproved of this. It's also worth noting, in terms of the extent of change that women experienced, yes, women went out to work more, but actually many women by the mid-1920s had returned to a sort of traditional lifestyle that they had before the war, and whilst there was large numbers of women who were involved in war industry and going out to work during the First World War, certainly half, if not if slightly the majority of them, went back to being at home, living the traditional life of a housewife, the traditional separate spheres existence where men went out to work and women stayed at home. So yes, there was change, but by no means was this change the case for everybody. And as you can see, as we saw earlier in the Matt Fry documentary, and also as we saw in Otto Dix's depiction of the Weimar woman, that some people were disapproving of this new woman, in inverted commas, and the extent of change for women in the 1920s was not as great as it may first seem. Okay, let's move on to task 3 now. One of the things that you have to do in the Germany paper for your GCSEs, you have to evaluate an interpretation. You have to say what you agree and disagree with about an interpretation using your own knowledge. So here we have an interpretation from Donna Marie Bohan from History Studies 2012 about Weimar Republic and the role of women. It says the Weimar Republic was a period in German history during which great political, social and cultural changes occurred. In addition to the new political system and the onset of rationalization and modernization, so that means people looking at things in a logical and modern way, gender roles and gender relations constituted key areas of change. So there was lots of change in gender roles. The experiences of both men and women during the First World War and the German Revolution had a decisive impact, so a big impact, an important impact, on the shaping of gender roles and gender relations during the Weimar Republic. The experience of war was crucial for the transformation of women's roles. Due to the men's absence or death, women substituted men as heads of household in many instances and frequently replaced them in areas of work and in political institutions. Wartime engendered, that means it created an increasing political consciousness, so a sense of political ideas and the importance of their own political ideas among women as they actively participated in protests to end the war. Right, so what you're going to do is you're going to reread that interpretation, and underneath you're going to use the information you've looked at so far in this little project, and you're going to write down things that you agree with in this interpretation, so knowledge that you can use to support it, but also anything that maybe you slightly disagree with or anything that's missing from this interpretation. The important thing is that you use the knowledge that you already have gained in order to support what you're saying, either in favour of or against the interpretation. So pause this, have a go at task 3. Okay, welcome back. Some of those of you with better hearing may have heard quite an excitable Bertie at the end of that clip, shouting as he ran down the corridor past the door to my study, because he's excited because he was going out for a walk and was about to have his wellies put on. Anyway, back to the Weimar Republic and the role of women. I think there's several things we could agree with this interpretation. Certainly the changing political role of women, you could point to them getting the vote, greater political equality. It talks about having a decisive impact on the shaping of gender roles and gender relations during the Weimar Republic. You could probably pick out the importance of some changes in women's role and talk about the new woman and talk about women's leisure time and how they use that differently to before. But you could also probably disagree and say, well, that was only a small minority of women and it was young unmarried women and it wasn't the case for all women. It also talks about women going into work and how that had a big impact. Well, of course, yes, you can agree with that. 75% of women were working during the First World War. However, you could counter that and say, well, look, if we look at what life was like by, say, 1925, when only 36% of women were working, that maybe this idea of women going out to work and being equal to men did not last entirely intact after the war in the way that it had during the war. And you might also point to the inequality, women not being involved in trade unions, women having different levels of pay to men, etc., etc. So the important thing is that you use the knowledge that you've got to weigh up evidence for and evidence against the interpretation, and point out maybe strengths of the interpretation and limitations of the interpretation. That is one of the key skills of GCSE. It's one of the key skills for this paper 3 on Germany. Okay, you're now going to move on to task 4 in your booklet. We now switch to the role of women in Nazi Germany. So the Nazis took power in Germany in 1933, and it was their ideas on the role of women in society that then dominated from 1933 to 39. Here's a classic example of their ideals about the importance of motherhood to a woman from the women's viewpoint, official Nazi women's magazine in 1939. So watch this little clip that's coming up and get a sense of what the Nazis' ideals were about what the role of women should be in society.
The Nazis embraced a separate spheres ideology about the role of men and women. It was men's job to go out to war and go out to work. It was a woman's role to stay at home and have children and nurture the next generation. In this sense, the Nazis completely rejected the feminism of the 1920s that was expressed in the cabaret culture and the cultural expression of the Weimar Republic. The Nazis passed in 1933 a marriage law, which made it easier for men and women to get married, and offered a government loan which did not have to be paid back if the couple produced a certain number of children. The Nazis celebrated motherhood. There was a motherhood cross for women who gave birth to multiple children. However, as time went on and there was a labour shortage in the economy, women were encouraged to go back out to work. And in 1937 a duty law was passed, which suggested that women needed to go and give some service to the Reich through employment. This contradiction left women in a strange position in Germany in the late 1930s. They were encouraged to stay at home and motherhood was valued, but by the same token, the expanding economy required their participation in the workforce. And for many women, this provided a very real contradiction and a real strain on their place in German society.
Okay, so what you're now going to do is you are going to look at the information on task 4. It looks similar to this in your booklet, and you're going to read this information, many of which builds upon what's just been said in the video clip there, and you're going to answer the 4 questions in your booklet that come after that. The important thing is to consider this idea that the Nazis are going against what the Weimar Republic, the direction the Weimar Republic was moving in terms of women being more liberated, the new woman ideology, and the different way in which women were able to express themselves. The Nazis went against this, and that links back to the first clip that we saw as part of this little project, which was Matt Fry talking about the cultural clash in Berlin, and that the Nazis in the shape of Joseph Goebbels were determined to kind of roll back this tide of greater expression and freedom for women, and they wanted to go back to a more traditional idea of what a woman would be and a more traditional view of society. And you're going to see that in the reading that you're going to do now. So read the information and then answer the questions. Pause this and off you go. Alright, welcome back. So, you should have answered those 4 questions. Question about whether or not these policies benefited women. Well, if you're a woman who wanted to get married and stay at home, and have lots of children, then of course these policies did benefit you. The law for the encouragement of marriage, the marriage loans, the esteem with which women who had lots of children, in which women who had lots of children were held. This was all great. There was an improvement in maternity care. There was a great emphasis on women being a mother. So if that was what you wanted your role as a woman in society to be, then those policies certainly benefited you. In terms of did the policies succeed, well, more children were born, there was an increase in marriage, the birth rate did go up, so to a certain extent they did succeed. However, there's also the question there of how consistent this is, and you could argue that that links to this question of how successful the policy was. When we get to 1937 and the law is passed to have a duty year so that women would have to go back out to work because there was a labour shortage, not as many women wanted to do that as the Nazis would have liked. And so in that sense, the policy of women staying at home and having children was successful. The final question, which asks about these policies in comparison with other Western countries, this wasn't massively radical. Okay, the inducement to get married and have children through the marriage loan scheme was a greater example of the government trying to encourage people to get married and have children than was the case in other countries. But the general idea that women should stay at home and look after the children and inhabit that particular sphere that was separate from men who should go out to work and should be the breadwinner, that was a dominant idea of the different roles that men and women should play in society that you could see in America, France, Britain, lots of other Western European and Western countries at the time. So the Nazis may have been pushing this more strongly because they wanted to increase the population and because eventually they were hoping that they were going to be able to expand the German population. But this wasn't, in terms of a general belief that women should be separate from men and women should stay at home, this wasn't a massive difference from what was happening in the rest of West. Okay, so we now come to the final task of this little project, task 5, that looks at a particular skill that's important in the Germany module, but it's also actually important in the First World War and Surgery module for GCSE, and that skill is to be able to assess how useful a source is. How useful a source is for an inquiry into a particular thing. So in this particular case, how useful a source is for an inquiry into Nazi policy towards women. You can see source B here. It's from a speech made by Joseph Goebbels in March of 1933. We know who Joseph Goebbels is. We know he was the Nazi propaganda minister. He was mentioned. You saw him in the Matt Fry clip at the start of this little project. This is a speech by him. It says, German women, German men, the birth rate in Germany is rapidly declining, so a major change is needed. We believe that German women must use their strength and abilities in different areas from men. Let me say this clearly. The first, best, and most suitable place for the woman is in the family. It is her most glorious duty to give children to her people and nation. The woman is the teacher of the youth, and therefore the builder of the foundation of the future. If the family is the nation's source of strength, the woman is at its centre. The best place for the woman to serve her people in her marriage, in the family, is motherhood. So, a very clear statement from Joseph Goebbels, what we'd expect him to say. Now, the crucial thing when answering these questions about how useful sources are is to look at what the source shows us and how that is useful in the context of what we know, so our contextual knowledge, and also the provenance, who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it, how that might make it useful or limited. So the way to tackle these questions is to pick something from the source. So, for instance, here we believe that German women must use their strengths and abilities in different areas from men. We could then say we know this is useful from our contextual knowledge because the Nazis believed in separate spheres ideology, and they believed that men and women should have different jobs and that women should stay at home. It says that her most glorious duty is to give children to her people and the nation. We know from our own knowledge, from the law for the encouragement of marriage, from the German motherhood cross, how important the Nazis thought it was that women should have children, and we can use detailed contextual knowledge from the work you've just read, the questions you've just answered, to be able to show why the source is useful. we also need to comment on the provenance. So this is by Joseph Goebbels. Well, this is particularly useful then if we're looking into Nazi policy towards women, because it comes from the Nazi propaganda minister who was speaking in March 1933 when the Nazis had just taken power, and therefore he is expressing what the Nazis believe about their policy towards women. So, you know, some people get trapped in this idea of saying, ooh, it's by a Nazi, so it's biased. Well, don't use that word biased. Of course it's by a Nazi, but that makes it useful. It doesn't make it limited. It makes it useful because the question's asking you how useful the source is for an inquiry into Nazi policy towards women. Well, if it's written by a Nazi, it's pretty useful in giving us into an insight into what they think about the role of women in society. Right, so now we move on to source C. You'll always be asked how useful are these sources, so there'll be two sources, in this case for an inquiry into Nazi policy towards women. This is a photograph from 1938. The photograph shows women working in a textile factory in a large industrial city. So, what does it show us? It shows us women working, it shows us that women went to work. There's not as much we can pick out of the source in order to different aspects of what the source is saying, because it's not a written source, it's a pictorial source, it's a photograph. So you look at the general thing that the photograph is showing you. So it's showing women working in a textile factory. What do we know from our contextual knowledge? Well, we know that women were encouraged to go back to working in factories, to go back to the workplace as a result of the 1937 duty year. We can see women working in a textile factory here. Women would have been working in a textile factory because men would not be doing those jobs because of the Nazis' aim to get more people into the army. Men would have been doing other jobs. We can show, therefore, this is a useful source for showing what some women were doing and some women's employment in the late 1930s. We could say that this source has a slight limitation because we know from our own information that not as many women as the Nazis wanted actually went back into the workforce and went back into employment in the way that Nazis envisaged. The provenance of this source, here is the crucial thing to focus on the date, which we've already mentioned. The source is useful because it's a photograph taken in this particular time, and at this particular time we know that women were being encouraged through the duty year to go back into the workplace. So it's the date of the photograph really which makes it useful, because we know that at this time there was a change in Nazi policy towards women, a slight inconsistency. On the one hand telling women to stay at home, and then later on saying actually we need women to go out to work because we have a labour shortage. The important thing is that what you've done is you've used your contextual knowledge. So you know what happened in 1937 with the duty year, and so therefore you're able to comment on how useful this source is. You could say that, you know, it's slightly limited. It's one photograph. It shows us one photograph of women working, and it doesn't give us a true impression of exactly how many women were working or how successful the Nazis' duty year was. The point is that both of the sources are useful for our inquiry into Nazi policy towards women because they show us elements of Nazi policy at different times. So, what you're going to do to finish off this particular project is you're going to have a go at writing an answer to the question, how useful are these sources for an inquiry into Nazi policy towards women? You need to write one big paragraph in relation to the first source and another paragraph in relation to the second source, and you should be focusing on what the source shows you in relation to that particular focus, so Nazi policy towards women, and then you should be saying how useful that source is, both the content of the source and the provenance of the source, in light of the contextual knowledge that you have gained during the rest of this project. So, have a go at writing that now. By all means, send that to your teacher when it's completed so that they can have a look at it and give you some feedback. I hope that this lesson has been useful. I hope that you've enjoyed the stuff that you've looked at, and until next time, goodbye. about the role of women in society. Western society during the 1930s.